Sarah Chen stood in her front yard early that morning, just as the sun was starting to rise over the Arizona mountains. The air was still cool, and this was her favorite time to work in her garden. She held her coffee mug in one hand while checking on her desert marigolds, which were showing their bright yellow faces to the morning light. These flowers were just one small part of the garden she had worked so hard to create over the last 3 years. When Sarah first moved to Desert Palms Estate, her yard had been like everyone else's, a boring patch of grass that needed constant watering to stay alive in the harsh desert climate. But Sarah, who grew up helping her grandmother tend a beautiful garden in California, knew there was a better way. Step by step, she had transformed her yard into something special. Instead of thirsty grass, she now had beautiful desert plants that needed very little water. Purple sage brushed against her legs as she walked the stone path she had laid herself. Bright red tuberosa flowers attracted hummingbirds, which had become regular visitors to her yard. Small lizards sunned themselves on the decorative rocks she had carefully placed between clusters of desert verbena and globe mallow. Everything in her garden belonged here, in the desert, and thrived without wasting precious water. Sarah checked the soil moisture around her newly planted penstemon when she heard the mail truck stop at her box. She didn't think much of it at first. Bills and junk mail could wait until she finished her morning garden check. But then she noticed her neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, looking at her with a worried expression from across the street. Mrs. Rodriguez quickly turned away when Sarah waved at her. Curious now, Sarah walked to her mailbox. Among the usual envelopes was an official-looking letter from the Desert Palms Homeowners Association. Her heart sank a little as she opened it. HOA letters were never good news. The words on the paper made her coffee turn bitter in her mouth. Notice of violation. Dear Ms. Chen, during our recent property inspection, it was observed that your front yard landscaping has been modified without proper HOA approval. The following violations were noted: unauthorized removal of approved turf grass, installation of unapproved plant species, modification of landscape design without submitted plans, installation of unauthorized hardscaping elements. As per Section 7.3 of the HOA guidelines, these modifications result in a fine of $500. You have 30 days to restore your property to its original approved condition or submit a detailed landscape plan for board review. Regards, Karen Mitchell, HOA Board President. Sarah's hands shook as she read the letter again. $500? For making her yard better? She looked at her garden, which was alive with morning activity. Bees visiting flowers, birds singing in the desert willow tree she had planted, butterflies floating between blooms. How could this be wrong? She remembered all the work she had put into this garden, the hours spent researching which native plants would work best, the weekends spent digging and planting under the hot sun, the careful attention she paid to each plant until it was established. Her water bill had dropped to less than half of what it used to be, and she had even started sharing seeds and cuttings with interested neighbors. Sarah walked back into her garden, past the desert marigolds that had greeted her earlier. Now she noticed things she hadn't before. Mrs. Peterson across the street watering her lawn, even though it was already starting to get hot. The lawn service trucks arriving at other houses, their mowers ready to cut grass that didn't belong in the desert, the sprinklers running at the HOA president's house, water spraying onto the sidewalk. Looking down at the violation notice again, Sarah felt something change inside her. This wasn't just about her garden anymore. This was about the right to make smart choices for the environment. This was about challenging old rules that didn't make sense in today's world. This was about standing up for what she believed in. She pulled out her phone and took pictures of her thriving garden. Then she went inside to her computer. If the HOA wanted to fight over her unauthorized vegetation, they were going to get one. But first, she needed to do her research. Sarah Chen was going to prove that her desert garden wasn't just beautiful, it was right. That evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open and a determined look on her face. Empty coffee cups and scattered papers surrounded her as she dove deeper into her research. That HOA's threatening letter lay next to her keyboard, its harsh words fueling her motivation to fight back. She started by downloading the complete Desert Palms HOA guidelines. It was a thick document filled with rules about everything from mailbox colors to holiday decorations. Sarah printed it out and grabbed her yellow highlighter. As she read through the landscaping section, she found something interesting. There were no specific rules against desert plants. The guidelines only mentioned that yards should be well maintained and aesthetically pleasing. "Got you," Sarah whispered, marking the page with a sticky note. Her next step was to check Arizona state laws. After an hour of searching government websites, Sarah discovered something that made her sit up straight in her chair. 6 months ago, Arizona had passed the Water-Wise Landscaping Protection Act. The law stated that HOAs couldn't force homeowners to plant grass or maintain water-hungry landscapes. They also couldn't fine people for using native plants or xeriscaping. Sarah grabbed her phone and took pictures of her water bills from the past 3 years. The numbers told a clear story. Her water usage had dropped by 65% since she replaced her lawn with native plants. She created a simple graph showing the decrease, knowing that visual evidence would help her case. But she didn't stop there. Sarah found the local water conservation office's website and downloaded their guidelines for desert-friendly yards. To her delight, her garden matched nearly all their recommendations. She even discovered that the city offered rebates to homeowners who converted their lawns to xeriscaping. Around midnight, Mrs. Rodriguez, her friendly neighbor, sent her a text message. "Sarah, heard about the HOA trouble. Check out the Desert Botanical Gardens website. They have a legal help section for native garden disputes." This new lead proved incredibly valuable. The Botanical Gardens website had a whole section about HOA conflicts. Sarah found stories of other homeowners who had successfully defended their right to grow native plants. She downloaded their sample letters and legal templates, adapting them for her situation. The next morning, Sarah walked around her garden with her phone, taking detailed pictures. She photographed the healthy plants, the drip irrigation system she had installed to save water, and the natural wildlife her garden attracted. A hummingbird buzzed around her head as she documented the tuberosa flowers, as if helping her make her point. She also took pictures of her neighbors' yards. Karen Mitchell's lawn, green as a golf course, had sprinklers running even though it had rained yesterday. The water ran down the sidewalk and into the street, wasted. Sarah noted the time and date on these photos. They would help show the contrast between her water-wise choices and the wasteful practices the HOA seemed to prefer. Back at her computer, Sarah organized all her evidence into a clear presentation: the state law protecting xeriscaping, her reduced water bills and usage graph, photos of her well-maintained garden, the city's water conservation guidelines, letters of support from the Desert Botanical Garden, scientific articles about the benefits of native plants, local news stories about water shortages, weather records showing the area's drought conditions. She printed everything and put it in a professional-looking folder. Then she wrote a formal letter to the HOA board, citing the new state law and requesting a hearing at their next meeting. Her hands were steady as she typed. She knew she was right, and now she had the evidence to prove it. That afternoon, Sarah dropped off her response letter at the HOA office. The secretary's eyes widened at the thick folder of supporting documents. As she walked home, Sarah noticed more details about her neighborhood: the dying patches in water-starved lawns, the stressed trees that weren't meant for desert life, the endless sound of sprinklers. Her garden welcomed her home with the sweet smell of desert lavender. A small lizard did push-ups on a rock, and butterflies danced around her sage plants. Sarah smiled, knowing she wasn't just fighting for her garden anymore. She was fighting for a better way of living in the desert, and she had the facts to back her up. The Desert Palms Community Center was unusually crowded that evening. Word had spread about Sarah's garden dispute, and many neighbors had come to watch. The monthly HOA board meeting was usually a quiet affair with empty chairs, but tonight people filled every seat. Some even stood along the walls, fanning themselves with the meeting agenda papers. Sarah sat in the front row, her folder of evidence on her lap. She wore her best business casual outfit, a blue blouse and black pants, to look professional. Mrs. Rodriguez sat next to her for support, occasionally patting her arm when she noticed Sarah's hands shaking slightly. Karen Mitchell, that HOA board president, sat at the center of the long table up front. Her perfectly styled hair and expensive clothes matched her perfect lawn at home. 4 other board members flanked her, all retirees who had lived in Desert Palms for over a decade. They shuffled through papers and whispered to each other while waiting for the meeting to start. The monthly meeting of Desert Palms Homeowners Association will now begin. Karen announced exactly at 7:00 p.m., tapping her gavel. First item on the agenda: landscaping violation at 1542 Saguaro Drive. Miss Chen, please present your case. Sarah walked to the podium, placing her folder on the small surface. The microphone squeaked as she adjusted it, making several people wince. She took a deep breath and began. "Thank you for allowing me to speak tonight," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I'm here because I received a $500 fine for my garden. My garden isn't just beautiful, it's legal and right for our desert environment." She pulled out her water bills and the graph she had made. "Since changing to native plants, I've saved over 60% on water usage. That's thousands of gallons saved every month." She held up the papers so everyone could see the dramatic drop in the graph's line. Karen Mitchell interrupted, her voice sharp. "Ms. Chen, the issue isn't water usage. The issue is that you failed to get proper approval for your changes. Our community has standards to maintain." Sarah was ready for this. She pulled out the new state law documents. According to Arizona's Water-Wise Landscaping Protection Act, passed 6 months ago, HOAs cannot force homeowners to maintain water-hungry landscapes. It's now illegal to fine residents for using native plants. A murmur went through the crowd. Karen's face turned slightly red, but she kept her composed smile. "Laws aside, Ms. Chen, your yard doesn't match our community aesthetic. Several neighbors have complained about its wild appearance." "That's not true." Mrs. Rodriguez stood up suddenly. "I never complained. In fact, I love Sarah's garden. The butterflies from her yard visit my flowers now too." Other voices joined in from the crowd. "Her yard looks better than the brown patches in my lawn. At least she doesn't waste water like some people. I want to know more about those desert plants." Karen banged her gavel repeatedly. "Order. This is not a public discussion. Board members, let's vote on upholding the violation." Sarah wasn't finished. She pulled out her phone and connected it to the room's projector. Pictures of her garden filled the screen, close-ups of blooming flowers, birds visiting the desert willow, butterflies on the lantana. Then she showed pictures of other yards in the neighborhood dying grass, water running down gutters, sprinklers spraying sidewalks. "My garden is not just legal, it's the future," Sarah said firmly. "Our city is in a drought. Water prices keep rising. We can fight nature and lose, or we can work with it and thrive." The room fell silent. Even Karen seemed momentarily speechless. Board member Tom Wilson, who had been quiet until now, cleared his throat. "Ms. Mitchell, given the new state law and the evidence presented, I move to rescind the fine." Karen's face darkened. "All those in favor of upholding the violation and fine?" Only Karen raised her hand. "All those in favor of rescinding the fine?" The other 4 board members raised their hands. The crowd broke into applause. Karen's voice could barely be heard over the clapping. "Fine rescinded. Meeting adjourned." She gathered her papers quickly and left through the side door. As people started leaving, several neighbors surrounded Sarah, asking questions about her plants and how to start their own desert gardens. Mrs. Rodriguez hugged her tightly. "You did it. You stood up to them and won." Sarah smiled, but she knew this was just the beginning. The real victory would come when more people understood that beautiful gardens didn't need to waste water. As she walked home that evening, she already had plans forming in her mind about how to help her neighbors transform their yards too. 2 weeks after the HOA meeting, Sarah noticed something different about her garden. It wasn't just the plants that were thriving. Her yard had become a bustling neighborhood of small creatures. She sat on her front porch early one morning, sipping her coffee and watching the unexpected show nature had brought to her doorstep. A family of quail marched across her garden path, the babies following their parents in a neat line like a tiny parade. They stopped to peck at seeds that had fallen from her desert sunflowers. Sarah hadn't seen quail in the neighborhood for years, not since everyone started putting in grass lawns. Hummingbirds zoomed between the red trumpet flowers, their wings making a soft buzzing sound in the morning air. They seemed to be having friendly arguments about which flowers belonged to whom. Sometimes they would pause midair, looking at Sarah as if to say thank you for the sweet nectar their wings worked so hard to reach. Mrs. Rodriguez walked by with her small dog, stopping to watch the morning activity in Sarah's garden. "Sarah, I've never seen so many butterflies in our neighborhood before," she called out, pointing to the orange and black monarchs dancing around the milkweed plants. "And look at those beautiful lizards doing push-ups on your rocks." Sarah smiled and walked over to chat with her neighbor. The lizards were desert spiny lizards, their blue bellies flashing in the morning sun as they did their funny exercise routines. They helped keep the garden free of unwanted insects, nature's own pest control team. "The birds are my favorite," Sarah told Mrs. Rodriguez. "Yesterday, I saw a roadrunner hunting in the back garden. It caught a cricket and ran off with its prize. When I first planted this garden, I never expected to create a whole wildlife sanctuary." As they talked, other neighbors started their morning walks. More people were stopping to look at Sarah's garden now, but not with the disapproving looks they used to give. Instead, they asked questions and took pictures with their phones. "What's that purple flowering bush?" asked Mr. Thompson from across the street. "I've never seen anything like it." "That's desert sage," Sarah explained. "It smells wonderful, needs almost no water, and the bees love it." Speaking of bees, Mrs. Rodriguez pointed out, "Have you noticed we're getting honeybees back? My vegetable garden is doing much better this year because of them." Sarah had noticed. Native bees and honeybees visited her garden from sunrise to sunset. They especially loved the desert lavender and sage plants. Their gentle humming added a peaceful music to the garden. Later that afternoon, Sarah spotted Karen Mitchell walking slowly past her house. The HOA president tried to look like she wasn't interested, but Sarah saw her taking pictures of the flowering plants with her phone. Even Karen couldn't ignore how alive and beautiful the garden had become. The next morning, Sarah found a note in her mailbox from the Jenkins family down the street. "Our kids love watching the butterflies in your garden on their way to school. Would you mind sharing some tips on how to attract them to our yard too?" Sarah started keeping a garden diary, writing down which creatures visited which plants. She noticed patterns. Certain flowers attracted specific butterflies, while different birds preferred particular seeds or insects. Her garden wasn't just surviving, it was creating a whole ecosystem. The weekly water truck that used to visit houses on her street now had fewer stops to make. Several neighbors had let patches of their lawns die off, thinking about what they might plant instead. Sarah often saw people walking by with their phones out, taking pictures and notes. One evening, as the sun set and the day's heat faded, Sarah sat on her porch again. The air was filled with the sweet smell of night-blooming desert flowers. Moths started appearing, their wings glowing silver in the twilight as they visited the evening primrose blooms. Bats swooped silently overhead, helping to control mosquitoes and other insects. A young couple walked by with their daughter, who looked about 5 years old. The little girl pointed excitedly at Sarah's garden. "Mommy, look! Fairy lights!" she squealed, seeing the first fireflies of the evening dancing among the plants. Sarah smiled, remembering how some neighbors had called her garden wild and messy just a few weeks ago. Now it was bringing magic to the neighborhood. Nature had become her strongest ally, showing everyone that true beauty doesn't need perfect grass lawns and sprinkler systems. Sometimes, it just needs a chance to come back home. August brought record-breaking heat to Desert Palms Estate. The temperature climbed to 115 degrees by mid-morning, and the weather report warned this heat wave could last for weeks. Sarah watched from her window as the morning sun turned the sky into a bowl of brass, harsh and heavy over the neighborhood. The real trouble started when everyone got their water bills for July. All across the neighborhood, people stood in their driveways, holding papers and wearing shocked expressions. Water rates had doubled, and the city had added a new surcharge for high usage during drought conditions. Karen Mitchell's perfectly green lawn was now costing her over $800 a month to maintain. Other neighbors faced similar bills, $600, $700, some even higher. The water company had included a bright red notice with each bill, Severe DROUGHGLORNANG, mandatory water restrictions in E50CT. That afternoon, Sarah's doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Rodriguez, holding her water bill with shaking hands. "Sarah, how much was your bill this month?" "Mine is $650. I can't afford this." Sarah went to get her own bill to show her neighbor. When Mrs. Rodriguez saw the total, $95, her eyes went wide. "How is that possible?" she asked. "Native plants," Sarah had explained simply. "They're built for the desert. They don't need much water to survive." Word spread quickly through the neighborhood about Sarah's tiny water bill. More neighbors started dropping by, asking questions about her garden. Even those who had voted against her at the HOA meeting wanted to know her secrets. The city's new water restrictions hit hard. Each house was given a water quota, and going over it meant heavy fines. Sprinklers were only allowed twice a week, for 15 minutes each time. The sound of lawnmowers faded as grass turned brown and crispy under the burning sun. Karen Mitchell tried to fight the dying of her lawn by running her sprinklers at night, thinking nobody would notice. But the water police, special city workers who looked for water waste, caught her and gave her a $1,000 fine. The next morning, her pristine grass had large brown patches that looked like desert spots on a green map. The HOA board called an emergency meeting at the community center. The room was packed again, but this time everyone looked worried instead of angry. The board members sat at their table, their own water bills spread out in front of them. "Our community's water usage is unsustainable," Tom Wilson announced, wiping sweat from his forehead. "The city warns that rates will go even higher if we don't reduce consumption. We need solutions." All eyes turned to Sarah, who sat quietly in the back row. Karen Mitchell's face turned red, but she nodded stiffly. "Ms. Chen," she said, her voice tight but polite, "would you be willing to share your landscaping expertise with the community?" Sarah stood up slowly. "I'd be happy to help," she said. "But first, we need to accept that green lawns don't belong in the desert. We need to work with nature, not against it." She pulled out her phone and showed recent pictures of her garden. Despite the heat wave, her plants looked healthy and green. Butterflies still visited her flowers, and birds still found shelter in her desert willow tree. "Your garden," Karen admitted, looking at the photos, "it's the only one in the neighborhood that doesn't look dead or dying right now." The meeting turned into an impromptu garden planning session. Sarah explained about desert-adapted plants, drip irrigation systems, and how to transition away from grass gradually. People took notes and asked questions. The HOA board members, seeing which way the wind was blowing, voted to suspend all fines related to lawn maintenance during the drought. As people left the meeting, Sarah overheard snippets of conversation. "We could put those purple sage plants along the driveway. My kids would love to watch butterflies in our yard. Think how much money we'll save on water." That evening, Sarah walked around her garden in the cooling darkness. The desert plants released their sweet night perfume, and somewhere a cactus wren sang its evening song. She smiled, knowing that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's showing others a better way forward. The water crisis had done what her arguments couldn't. It had made people ready to change. And this time, nature itself was on her side. September brought changes to Desert Palms Estate that nobody could have predicted 3 months ago. Every weekend, the sound of shovels and wheelbarrows replaced the usual noise of lawnmowers. Sarah's phone kept buzzing with text messages from neighbors asking for gardening advice. Mrs. Rodriguez was the first to transform her yard. Sarah helped her pick out desert plants from the local nursery, which was now having trouble keeping native species in stock. They spent a Saturday morning planting salvias, desert marigolds, and little clusters of desert bells. Mrs. Rodriguez's small dog supervised from the shade, wagging his tail at their progress. "Look at how much smaller my water bill is already," Mrs. Rodriguez told everyone who passed by, "and I haven't even finished removing all the grass yet." She had become Sarah's biggest supporter, showing off her water bill like a proud parent showing baby pictures. The Thompson family next door caught the desert gardening fever too. Their teenage sons, who used to complain about mowing the lawn, now helped their parents lay out rocks and plant barrel cactus. They even started a competition to see who could spot the most different types of birds visiting their new garden. "Mom, we got hummingbirds," Jake Thompson shouted one morning, running inside to get his bird guide. "That's 5 new species this week." The local news station heard about the neighborhood's transformation and sent a reporter to cover the story. They interviewed Sarah in her garden, which was now in full bloom despite the hot weather. The camera caught a scene of butterflies dancing around her desert willows while she explained how native plants help save water. "This isn't just about pretty flowers," Sarah told the reporter. "It's about living in harmony with our desert environment. Every plant in this garden belongs here naturally. They don't need us to waste water keeping them alive." The news story caught the attention of the city council. They decided to use Desert Palms Estate as an example for their new water conservation campaign. Signs went up around the neighborhood. "Desert Palms, leading the way in water-wise living." Even Karen Mitchell, who had fought so hard against Sarah's garden, started making changes. She began small, replacing dead patches of grass with desert shrubs. When the first flowers bloomed in her new plants, Sarah spotted her taking pictures with a proud smile. The nursery owner, Mr. Garcia, could hardly keep up with demand. "I've never sold so many native plants," he told Sarah when she visited his shop. "I had to hire 2 new workers just to handle all the orders from your neighborhood." He had created a special desert palms package of plants that worked well together and attracted wildlife. Each package came with a care guide that Sarah had helped him write, explaining how to water and maintain the plants. The children in the neighborhood discovered new ways to play. Instead of running through sprinklers, which weren't allowed anymore anyway, they started having butterfly counting contests. Some made bird-watching journals, competing to spot the most species. The Thompson boys even started a small business helping older neighbors install drip irrigation systems. One evening, as Sarah walked through the neighborhood, she noticed how different everything looked. Gardens that once held nothing but grass now bloomed with purple sage, yellow brittlebush, and orange desert marigolds. The sounds had changed too. Instead of sprinklers, she heard birds singing and bees humming. People sat on their front porches more often now, watching the sunset paint the desert flowers in golden light. Neighbors talked to each other across their gardens, sharing stories about which plants attracted the most butterflies or how their water bills had dropped. The transformation wasn't just about gardens. It was about community. People who had barely spoken to each other before now swapped gardening tips and shared cuttings from their plants. Children learned about nature in their own front yards. Elderly residents found new joy in watching wildlife visit their gardens. Sarah's phone buzzed with another text message. This one was from Karen Mitchell. "Would you mind taking a look at my garden plan? I want to add some of those purple flowers that the butterflies love so much." Sarah smiled as she typed her reply. Sometimes the best changes happen slowly, one garden at a time, one neighbor at a time, until suddenly you look around and realize everything is different. And better. October brought cooler weather and big changes to Desert Palms Estate. The HOA board called a special meeting, but this time the atmosphere was completely different from the tense gathering of a few months ago. The community center was decorated with photos of the neighborhood's new desert gardens, and someone had even brought cookies shaped like cactus plants. Sarah arrived early to find every seat already taken. People sat chatting excitedly about their gardens, sharing pictures on their phones of new birds they'd spotted or flowers that had just bloomed. The energy in the room felt more like a garden club meeting than an HOA gathering. Tom Wilson, now acting as temporary HOA president since Karen Mitchell's resignation last week, called the meeting to order. "As you all know," he began, "our community has gone through some big changes lately. Our water usage is down by 60% compared to last year, and the city has recognized us as a model water-wise community." He pulled up a PowerPoint presentation showing graphs of the neighborhood's water consumption. The line on the chart dropped sharply starting from August, when the water crisis had hit. Next to these numbers were pictures showing the transformation, before and after shots of yards changing from brown grass to colorful desert gardens. "The city has offered to give our community a $50,000 grant," Tom announced, causing excited whispers to spread through the room. This money would help more homeowners convert their lawns to desert landscaping. But to qualify, we need to officially change our HOA landscaping guidelines. Sarah sat up straighter in her chair. This was what she had been waiting for, real, official change that would protect desert gardens for years to come. She looked around the room, remembering how just a few months ago, these same people had been ready to fine her for her garden. The new guidelines were projected on the screen. Native and desert-adapted plants would be encouraged. Water conservation methods would be required. Artificial grass would be allowed as an alternative to real grass. Rock and gravel landscaping would be permitted. Drip irrigation systems would be mandatory for new installations. Each home would be required to have at least 3 types of plants that support local wildlife. Mrs. Rodriguez raised her hand. "What about people who still want some grass for their kids or pets?" Tom nodded. "Good question. The new rules allow for small grass areas, but they must be water-efficient varieties and can't take up more than 25% of the yard. We're trying to find a balance." The Thompson boys would become local experts on wildlife gardens, gave a short presentation about the birds and butterflies that had returned to the neighborhood. They showed pictures they'd taken of roadrunners, quail families, and even a hawk that now visited regularly. "Last year, we counted 3 types of birds in our yard," Jake Thompson said. "Now we've seen 28 different species. And the butterflies, we got monarchs back." Sarah's garden design guide, which she had been sharing informally, would become the official HOA handbook for new residents. The local nursery had agreed to give discounts to Desert Palms residents who wanted to buy native plants. When it came time to vote on the new guidelines, the result was unanimous. Everyone raised their hand in favor. People burst into applause when Tom announced the result. It wasn't just a policy change. It was a community choosing a new direction together. After the meeting, Sarah found a surprise waiting. Karen Mitchell stood by the door, holding a small pot with a desert marigold plant. "I owe you an apology," she said, handing Sarah the plant. "I was wrong about the gardens. My new native plants have cut my water bill by 75%. And yesterday I saw a hummingbird in my yard for the first time." Sarah accepted the plant with a smile. "The desert knows what it's doing," she said. "We just have to learn to listen." As people left the meeting, they were already making plans. The Thompsons were organizing a neighborhood birdwatching club. Mrs. Rodriguez was planning a native plant exchange. Someone suggested creating a community website to share garden photos and tips. Sarah walked home in the cool evening air, past yards that now bloomed with desert flowers instead of struggling grass. She heard the soft call of a cactus wren and saw bats swooping overhead, hunting insects in the twilight. The neighborhood hadn't just changed its rules. It had found a new way of living in harmony with the desert. 1 year had passed since Sarah received that first angry HOA letter about her garden. As she sat on her front porch on a pleasant spring morning, she could hardly believe how much Desert Palms estate had changed. The neighborhood had transformed from a sea of struggling grass lawns into a beautiful desert oasis. The morning sun lit up the community's new landscape like a painting. Desert marigolds created pools of gold, purple sage added splashes of color, and red tuberosa flowers dotted the yards like tiny flames. The sound of sprinklers had been replaced by the gentle songs of birds and the soft humming of bees. Sarah sipped her morning coffee and watched the daily parade of wildlife in her garden. A family of quail marched past, the babies now almost as big as their parents. Butterflies danced between flowers, and hummingbirds zoomed back and forth like tiny fighter jets. A roadrunner stood on top of a rock, proudly showing off a lizard it had caught for breakfast. Mrs. Rodriguez walked by with her dog, stopping to chat as she did every morning. Her front yard, once plain grass, now looked like a desert botanical garden. "Did you see the notice?" she asked excitedly. "They're announcing the Garden Awards today." The Desert Palms Garden Awards had been Tom Wilson's idea. As the new permanent HOA president, he had started this yearly competition to encourage more people to create wildlife-friendly yards. Categories included Best Water-Wise Design, Most Butterflies Attracted, and Best Wildlife Habitat. Sarah had helped judge the competition, excusing herself from entering since she had become the neighborhood's unofficial garden expert. Over the past year, she had helped dozens of neighbors plan their desert gardens. The local nursery even gave her a special discount to share with anyone she sent their way. The award ceremony was scheduled for that afternoon in the community center. As Sarah walked there, she noticed how different the neighborhood felt from a year ago. Children played in the native garden paths instead of on grass lawns. Neighbors chatted across their yards, sharing stories about which birds had visited that day. Even the air smelled different, sweet with desert flowers instead of wet grass. The community center was packed. The Thompson boys had created a slideshow of wildlife photos taken in neighborhood gardens throughout the year. Their bird count had reached 50 different species, and they had started a popular blog about desert wildlife gardening. Karen Mitchell, who now led the community's water conservation committee, stood up to make the first announcement. "Our neighborhood's transformation has caught the attention of the whole city," she said proudly. Desert Palms Estate has reduced its water usage by 80% compared to last year. The water company is using us as an example for other communities. The awards began. Mrs. Rodriguez won Best Butterfly Garden for her amazing collection of native plants that attracted monarchs. The Thompsons got Best Wildlife Photography for their detailed documentation of birds. Even Karen won an award for Most Improved Garden, making everyone laugh and applaud. Then Tom Wilson took the microphone. "We have one special award left," he announced. "This isn't a category we advertised because it's being given to someone who wasn't allowed to compete." He smiled at Sarah. "That HOA board has created the Desert Palms Sustainable Landscape of the Year award, and it goes to the garden that started it all, Sarah Chens." The room burst into applause. Sarah felt tears in her eyes as she walked up to accept the small trophy, which was shaped like a saguaro cactus. It seemed like just yesterday when these same people had been ready to fine her for her garden choices. "Sarah's garden showed us a better way to live in the desert," Tom continued. "She turned what could have been a fight into a movement that brought our community together. And look at us now. We're not just saving water, we're creating a better environment for wildlife and for ourselves." As Sarah walked home that evening, carrying her trophy, she stopped to look at her garden in the sunset light. The plants seemed to glow with their own inner light, and the evening primrose flowers were just starting to open. A hummingbird took one last drink from a desert honeysuckle before heading to its nest. She remembered that angry HOA letter from a year ago and smiled. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even or proving others wrong. Sometimes it's about showing people a better way forward, and then helping them walk that path together. Her garden hadn't just won an award. It had helped create a community where both people and nature could thrive.